Welcome back to another gentle episode of Boring History for Sleep, where the stories are calm, the voices are soft, and history becomes your companion to peaceful dreams. Tonight, let me take you far back in time to a kingdom that once covered all of Spain. Imagine a world where kings wore golden crowns, where warriors marched under the hot sun, and where grand cathedrals echoed with prayers day and night. In this calm history for sleep, we will uncover the story of the Visigoths, a people who ruled for 3 centuries, believing their power would last forever, yet they vanished almost overnight. Why did this mighty kingdom fall? Was it betrayal, greed, pride, or simply the silent force of time? As you listen to this boring sleep story, feel the weight of their swords, hear the chants in their ancient churches, and see the lonely castles they left behind, all while your body relaxes and your mind slowly drifts away from the worries of today. This is your time to rest. Close your eyes, get comfortable, and let this sleep history guide you into dreams, where forgotten kings walk silent halls and history whispers its secrets just for you. Welcome to another journey of boring history for sleep. Let's begin. The victims of imperial vengeance suffered deeply, mainly because of the fierce tribes that Honorius's minister had brought into the empire. These tribes were marched all the way from the cold shores of the Baltic Sea, with the aim of crushing the rising rebellions against Roman rule. However, this decision, even if it was not a planned betrayal, was certainly foolish and short-sighted. Between the years 395 and 415 AD, these same barbarians, whom the minister had invited into the empire's heart, soon discovered its hidden weakness. At first, they acted like allies, but gradually they became the true masters. Their eyes were filled with greedy desire for the rich, fertile lands of southern France and Spain, lands blooming with wealth and beauty. Finally, when they saw that the great Pyrenean mountains, which guarded the entrance to Spain, were carelessly defended, they seized their chance. The Suevi, led by their king Hermeric, the Alans under Atas, and the Vandals, also known as the Silingli under their leader Gunderic, broke through this barrier. In the year 409 AD, they poured their wave of destruction into the Iberian Peninsula. The devastation they caused was beyond imagination. Entire towns were looted and burned to ashes. The countryside was left barren and silent. Men, women, and children were killed without any mercy or distinction. But this was only the beginning of greater horrors. Soon, famine and deadly diseases spread across the land like a dark shadow. Wild beasts, finding nothing to hunt in their usual forests, began attacking humans. Starving people, driven mad with hunger, even ate the corpses of the dead. Some stories tell of mothers killing their own children just to feed upon their flesh. At last, the conquerors realized that turning these lands into a lifeless desert was not wise if they wished to live there permanently. So, they divided the lands among themselves. Boudica fell into the hands of the Vandals, Lusitania was claimed by the Alans, and Galicia, along with large parts of Leon and Castile, was taken by the Suevi. The arrival of the Goths in 411 AD brought an even greater threat to the new settlers of these lands. This fourth people were more powerful and fearsome than all the tribes who had come before them. They were led by Adolf, also known as Adolphus. Honorius, the Roman emperor, cleverly managed to remove them from Italy by offering them the rich and fertile provinces of southern Gaul and the Iberian Peninsula as a gift. Adolf established his kingdom seat in Narbonne. There, he married Placidia, an imperial princess whom he had taken captive. After securing his rule in Gaul, he crossed the Pyrenees with confidence, entered Barcelona in triumph, and from there, he launched several attacks against the Vandals to strengthen his power. However, his reign came to a sudden and tragic end. One day, while he stood proudly watching his cavalry train in the courtyard of his palace in Barcelona, a conspiracy against his life succeeded. A dwarf, hidden among the men, stabbed him with a sword, ending his life in an instant. After his death, Sigeric became king. But his cruel and ruthless behavior made him instantly hated by the Goths. He showed no mercy and put to death the 6 surviving children of Adolf. As if this was not enough, he forced the grieving widow, Placidia, to walk barefoot through the streets of Barcelona to humiliate her in front of all. His brutality was too much to bear, and soon another conspiracy arose against him. He was removed from the throne and killed. Next, the Goths selected Wallia as their king in 415 AD. He was a wise and worthy leader, respected by his people. His first ambition was to conquer the Roman territories in Africa, but nature herself stopped him. A violent storm destroyed his fleet, forcing him to abandon his plans. News of Wallia's failure reached Gaul quickly. It encouraged Constantius, the powerful general of Honorius, to march with a large army towards the Pyrenees. Wallia gathered the remaining strength of his troops and prepared to face him. But destiny had other plans. Constantius was not driven only by ambition for war. In his heart burned a desire for Placidia, as the emperor had promised her hand to him. When the two armies finally stood facing each other, Constantius immediately offered peace under conditions too favorable to reject. Wallia simply had to return Placidia to the Romans and promised to march his forces against the Suevi and other barbarian tribes still holding parts of the peninsula. In return, the Romans promised not just peace, but their friendship. Placidia was handed back, and peace was secured between the Goths and the Romans, bringing a temporary calm to these troubled lands. Hostilities now began with full force against the kindred barbarian tribes who still held power in the peninsula. The Vandals, unable to stand against the attacks, were driven out of their homes. Helpless and desperate, they fled to seek refuge among the Suevi in the distant lands of Galicia. The Alans of Lusitania met an even darker fate. They were almost completely destroyed along with their king, Atace. Those few who survived merged with the Vandals, and from that day onward, the name of the Alans vanished forever from the lands of Spain. The Suevi, realizing that they too might be crushed like the others, quickly submitted themselves to Rome. They declared themselves as humble tributaries, and in return, they were allowed to remain peacefully in the lands they had settled. Honorius, filled with pride, saw these great victories as his own achievements. As a reward for his loyalty and success, the Gothic victor was granted a vast region stretching across Languedoc and Gascony, from the grand city of Toulouse all the way to the ocean. Toulouse became the shining capital of his kingdom, where he ruled with power until his death 2 years later, after all his glorious triumphs. From this time until the reign of Euric, the Goths mostly stayed within their new lands in Gaul and rarely entered Spain. Though they believed themselves to be the true lords of these lands, in reality, the Suevi and Vandals held the real power over Spain. Later, under the rule of Theodoric I, who succeeded Wallia, the Vandals once again raised their swords, this time against the Suevi. The Suevi, overwhelmed by the fierce attacks, retreated deep into the mountain fortresses of Asturias to save themselves. Victorious, the Vandals left Galicia behind and fought their way back to their old settlements in Baetica, from where Wallia had once expelled them. It was here that they left their mark forever, giving their name to this province, Vandalusia. In time, this name softened and changed into what we now know as Andalusia. In these southern lands, the Vandals grew stronger. They built fleets along the ports of Andalusia and Granada. Their ships sailed far, spreading terror wherever they went. They attacked the Balearic Isles, pillaged the peaceful coast of Valencia, sacked the proud city of Cartagena, and laid waste to the distant shores of Mauritania in Africa. Returning victorious to Seville, their king, Gunderic, committed his final act of greed. He plundered the rich and sacred church of St. Vincent, taking all its treasures. But a new and even grander path soon opened before the Vandals. Boniface, the powerful prefect of Africa, offered them 2/3 of his land if they would come to his aid against his enemies. Eager for this golden chance, the Vandals accepted with joy. Yet before they left Spain, they unleashed one last wave of destruction upon their old foes, the Suevi. Near the city of Merida, they crushed them in battle, throwing their king and his warriors into the dark waters of the Guadiana River. Having done this, they calmly made their way back to the seacoast. In March of the year 429, just 18 years after they had first arrived in Spain, around 80,000 Vandals boarded their ships and crossed the waters to Africa, seeking a new destiny in lands far beyond the horizon. The departure of the restless Vandals to Africa did not bring peace to the troubled lands of Spain. Instead, the Suevi, under their new king Hermeric, emerged from their dark and rugged mountains, descending fiercely upon the peaceful people of Galicia. Their attacks brought fear and suffering once again to lands already weary of bloodshed and chaos. But it was Hermeric's son Richelon who would truly lift the name of the Suevi to the heights of power. In the year 438, Hermeric stepped down from his throne and handed the scepter to his son. Richelieu proved to be a brave and ambitious ruler. He defeated the Roman forces by the banks of the Vanille River, a victory that shook the empire's pride. Soon after, he seized the great cities of Merida and Seville, strengthening the Suevi's hold over western Spain. Meanwhile, beyond the mountains in Gaul, Theodoric, the powerful king of the Goths, was busy weakening Roman rule in southern Gaul. Although he planned to march against the triumphant Suevi to crush their rising power, destiny summoned him elsewhere. News arrived of a far greater threat approaching. Attila, the mighty king of the Huns, was advancing like a storm across the lands. Theodoric's courage and skill as a warrior placed him at the head of the right wing of the united armies of Franks, Romans, and Goths. Together, they prepared to halt Attila's terrifying advance. In the year 451, on the wide plains of Chalons, a great battle was fought. The barbaric pride of Attila was broken there, but the victory came at a cost. Theodoric fell in battle, dying among his warriors. His death only increased the love and respect his people had for him. They raised his son, Torismond, to the throne with gratitude and hope. But Torismond's reign was brief and ended in tragedy. Within a single year, his own two brothers turned against him. In their hunger for power, they killed him in the capital city of Toulouse, seizing the empire and taking his life. The elder of these two fratricides, Theodoric II, was then crowned as king. The reign of Theodoric II brought both victories and defeats. At first, he turned his army south towards Spain and attacked the Suevi. He defeated them in battle and captured their king, Ricciarius, proving the strength of Gothic power once more. But soon, Theodoric II was called back to France to protect his other territories. The army he left behind in Spain acted with greed and cruelty. Their crimes angered the brave people of Leon, who rose up and crushed them, driving them away in humiliation. By this time, Spain had fallen into the deepest misery. Everywhere, Goths, Romans, and Suevi roamed, bringing ruin to the land. They left behind only ashes, blood, and sorrow wherever they went. As if these horrors were not enough, another fierce tribe, the Herulians, landed on the shores of Catalonia. They eagerly joined in the destruction, plundering towns and spreading fear wherever they stepped. The Suevi themselves were divided into two bitter factions, each driven by hatred for the other. They fought each other without mercy, yet when the chance arose to plunder the helpless natives, or to stand united against the Goths and Romans, they laid aside their differences and joined hands in cruelty and greed. Thus, the darkness of war and suffering continued to spread, with no end in sight for the people of these troubled lands. The Spaniard, in these dark times, became the helpless prey of all. His hard-earned labor, the fruits of his sweat and toil, was consumed by the endless swarms of invaders pouring down from the Pyrenees to the distant rock of Calpe. Like clouds of locusts, they settled upon the land, devouring everything in their path, leaving behind only hunger and sorrow. This scourge was not merely painful, it was unbearable. The people could no longer endure such cruelty and destruction. At last, out of despair, native bands began to rise in many parts of the peninsula. But instead of bringing justice or hope, these bands turned into roaming groups driven by vengeance and greed. They did not only attack the rapacious invaders, they plundered anyone who crossed their path, turning their own lands into a place of fear and betrayal. For the weary Spaniards, their own brothers now became as terrifying as the foreign barbarians. Many of these horrors might have been avoided if Theodoric had been free to return to Spain himself and bring it under his strong and organized rule. But he was held back, trapped in wars against the Romans, the Burgundians, and the Franks, which kept him fully occupied for many long years. At last, Theodoric's life came to a violent end. In his capital city of Toulouse, he was assassinated, and whispers spread that his own brother, Euric, was the one who ended his life to gain power. Rising as the new Gothic king, Euric's first act was to send a powerful army into Spain to crush the pride of the Suevi once and for all. His campaign was swift and successful. The Suevi, realizing they could not stand against him, begged for peace. Euric allowed them to remain in Galicia, along with parts of modern Leon and Portugal. They were also permitted to keep their kings, though their independence had vanished. They now lived under the quiet shadow of Gothic power, no longer warriors of freedom, but vassals who bowed before their conquerors. For nearly a century, the Suevi remained silent and subdued. Their swords lay rusting, their war cries silenced, and their lands ruled in the name of their Gothic overlords. Nothing more was heard of their power or pride until the time of Luvagild, the Gothic king who, as you will hear later, struck the final blow to their existence as a nation and merged them forever into the great realm of the Goths. Thus, the weary lands of Spain continued to bear the heavy chains of conquest, waiting in silence for the next chapter of their fate. The Romans were far less fortunate than the Goths or the Suevi. Their long-held domination over Spain came to a bitter end with the fall of Tarragona. Though they still clung to a few small places along the coast, it was not out of bravery or strength that they kept them. Rather, it was because Euric, the Gothic conqueror, had no naval force strong enough to attack these coastal settlements from the sea. Euric now stood as the master of all Spain, but his ambitions reached far beyond its borders. To him, Spain alone felt too narrow for his dreams of power. Rome herself was trembling towards her final collapse, and Euric resolved to snatch away some of her richest provinces in Gaul before they slipped into the hands of others. Odoacer the mercenary, who ruled as king of Italy, surrendered to Euric all the Roman provinces beyond the Alps, stretching as far as the Rhine and the ocean. From that moment onwards, the Goths considered both Gaul and Spain their rightful inheritance. The mighty victor chose Arles as the seat of his empire. There, in that ancient city, he spent the rest of his days in tranquility, ruling with unquestioned power. Euric died in Arles in the year 484 AD. Before his death, he commanded his subjects to choose his son Alaric as their next king. Euric was truly the founder of the Gothic kingdom of Spain. By destroying the Roman hold and subduing the Suevi, he became the absolute ruler of the peninsula. The 6 kings who had reigned before him ruled mainly in Gaul, and though they believed Spain was rightfully theirs, they had never fully subdued it. Their victories were partial and short-lived. Before Euric, Spain had only been overrun by invaders, not truly conquered. Euric also became the first great legislator of his people. The laws he gathered and set into writing became the foundation for the famous Gothic code known as the Forum Judicum, or Fuero Juzgo. He was indeed a great prince, but his memory is forever stained by dark deeds. The fratricide that is believed to have opened his path to the throne, and the cruel persecution he unleashed upon the Orthodox Christians, for like his predecessors, he followed the Arian faith, remain dreadful marks against his name. Alaric, his son, could not walk in his father's mighty footsteps. Even though his father-in-law Theodoric, who had just founded the kingdom of the Ostrogoths in Italy, tried to support him, Alaric faced a powerful enemy. Clovis, the fierce Frankish king, marched boldly towards Poitiers, where Alaric was staying. Clovis had vowed to drive the Arian Visigoths out of Gaul, whom he called heretics. A great battle followed. The Visigoths fought bravely, but they were defeated with heavy losses, and their king, Alaric, fell dead upon the battlefield. Clovis continued his victories, conquering most of their lands in southern France, and entered their proud capital, Toulouse, as a triumphant ruler. Alaric left behind a son, but he was too young to rule. In his place, Gasalric, Alaric's illegitimate brother, used his cunning to claim the throne as the new king. However, their fortunes soon changed again. The king of the Ostrogoths invaded Gaul to defend his Visigothic kin. He defeated the Franks, who were laying siege to Carcassonne, and forced Gasalric to flee to Barcelona for safety. Clovis, realizing he could not stand against the mighty Theodoric, humbly sued for peace. Theodoric then united the 2 powerful kingdoms of the Ostrogoths and Visigoths under his rule. To one of his most trusted generals, Theodes, he gave the task of governing Spain and acting as guardian to his young grandson. When Theodoric's grandson reached an age suitable to rule, Theodoric handed over the scepter of Spain to him, and Theud stepped away from power into a quiet, private life. Thus, the lands of Spain and Gaul passed into new hands, but their stories of war, betrayal, and conquest continued to echo across the centuries, shaping the destiny of their people. Amalaric was the first Gothic king to truly establish his royal court in the lands of Spain, choosing the ancient and noble city of Seville as his seat of power. To Athalaric, the ruler who succeeded Theodoric, Amalaric ceded the lands of France lying between the Rhone and the Alps. In return, he received his father's treasures, which Theodoric had once taken from Carcassonne to Ravenna. Athalaric also confirmed Amalaric's rule over the remaining territories of Gothic Gaul, along with all of Spain, sealing his authority with honor and ceremony. Seeking to strengthen his position against the mighty Franks, Amalaric arranged to marry Clotilda, the sister of Clovis's sons. But what he had hoped would bring peace only brought misery. Amalaric was a firm believer in Arian Christianity, while Clotilda remained deeply devoted to Orthodox faith. At first, both tried to change each other's beliefs, but when their efforts failed, their hearts filled with bitterness, his with anger and hers with contempt. The growing cruelty and disrespect towards Clotilda reached her family. Her brother, Childebert, marched against Amalaric in rage and vengeance. The outcome was tragic for the Gothic king. Whether he died by the sword in battle, as the historian Procopius claims, or whether he was slain while seeking refuge in a church remains a mystery lost to time. This final battle is believed to have been fought not in Gaul but upon the lands of Catalonia. After the victory, Childebert returned to France, taking his sister and carrying away vast treasures looted from the Arian churches. With Amalaric's death ended the royal line of the mighty Alaric. In the year 531, Theudes was unanimously chosen as the new king. For many years, he struggled against the ambitions and vengeance of Clovis's sons. The lands of Gothic Gaul slipped away beyond his grasp, but within Spain, he defended his kingdom with strength and wisdom against the invading forces of Childebert and Clotaire, who ravaged his territories with fire and sword. Flushed with victory and determined to expand his power, Theudes led his forces across the Straits of Gibraltar and laid siege to Ceuta, then held by the troops of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Visigoths attacked with energy and discipline, and soon it seemed that this stronghold, recently captured by Belisarius, would fall into their hands. But fate turned upon Theudes in an unexpected way. Though he was an Arian, he held deep respect for the Sabbath day. On that holy day, he ordered his troops to lay down their weapons and gather for public worship instead of battle. The besieged enemy, less strict in their observance, saw their chance. They poured out of the city gates and fell upon the Goths as they prayed, slaughtering them mercilessly. The carnage was so great that Theudes barely escaped with his life. This disaster weighed heavy upon him, and he did not live much longer. In the end, an assassin slipped quietly into the secret chambers of his palace and struck him down with a dagger. As he lay dying, it is said that he ordered no punishment for his killer. He believed his death to be the judgment of heaven, punishing him for a similar murder he himself had committed many years before. Despite his tragic end, Theudes was remembered as a just, valiant, and wise ruler. He brought internal peace to his kingdom, treating the Orthodox Christians with as much favor as his own Arian brethren, ruling with fairness and earning the respect of all who lived under his reign. Of the two Gothic kings who next held the scepter after Theudes, history tells us only little, and what it does tell is dark and sorrowful. The first of these was Theodicella, once a celebrated general under Theudes. He had gained fame for his bravery in the wars against the Franks, yet as king, he showed a very different face to the world. Theodicella became a ruler lost in vile pleasures and shameless desires. His life turned into a spectacle of greed and lust, earning him the name of a second Sardanapalus, the infamous king known for drowning in his own corruption. But such wickedness does not go unpunished for long. Within just 18 months of his rule, his nobles could bear his behavior no more. One evening, as he sat dining with them in his grand palace in Seville, the lights were suddenly put out. In that thick darkness, a dozen swords pierced his body, ending his sinful reign with silent, swift vengeance. After him came Aguila, but peace did not return with this new king. His entire reign was filled with unrest and rebellion. Many cities refused to accept his rule, rejecting him as their king. In anger, Aguila set out with his army to crush these rebellions and force their submission. Yet fate did not favor him. He faced Atanagild, a powerful and ambitious Gothic noble who rose against him. Defeated and shamed by his enemy, Aguila found himself surrounded by his own soldiers who had turned against him. In the end, they rose up and killed their king in the year 554. Thus, the throne of the Goths saw only turmoil and bloodshed, with rulers falling one after another and the land left trembling under endless storms of betrayal and war. Scarcely had Atanagild secured the Gothic throne, the dream for which he had struggled so fiercely, when he realized the bitter truth that his ambition had blinded him to danger. His imperial ally, Justinian, whose support had helped him gain the crown, revealed his true intentions. The troops of Justinian, far from withdrawing, settled firmly into the lands of Spain. From their powerful fortresses in the Carthaginian province, they defied Atanagild's authority, making it clear that they would not leave. Their presence became an unmovable burden upon the kingdom, nor did the kings who followed Atanagild fare any better. The unwelcome Roman intruders remained in Spain for many years, until, little by little, they blended with the Gothic people, becoming part of the land they once sought to control. Atanagild himself is remembered less for his own deeds and more for the tragic fates of his two daughters. One he married to Sigebert, king of Metz, while the other, Galswintha, known also as Galsvinda or Gosvinda, became the wife of Chilperic, king of Soissons. But her marriage was doomed to sorrow. Chilperic, driven by his cold ambition and under the poisonous influence of his mistress Fredegund, ordered her murder, silencing her forever in betrayal and blood. In Spain, the memory of her sister, Brunhild, is held with honor and deep reverence, but in France, her name is stained with infamy. After her husband's death, Brunhild suffered greatly at the hands of the unprincipled Fredegund and the ruthless Chilperic. Her end came many years later in tragedy when Clotaire commanded her death. These stories belong more to the turbulent history of France than to that of Spain, but they remain reminders of the shadows cast by power, revenge, and hatred. Whether Brunhild was guilty or innocent, history offers many voices on both sides. But above all, her tale shows how national prejudice blinds the wise and hardens the hearts of the good. During Atanagild's reign, a profound change took place among the Suevi. About a century earlier, under their king Reciarius, they had turned away from pagan beliefs to the teachings of Arius. Now, under their king Theodomer, they renounced Arianism and embraced the Orthodox Christian faith. Theodomer and his court were solemnly rebaptized, entering once again into the fold of the true church. Although they lived under Gothic rule, the Suevi still retained their own kingly government. Atanagild ruled with justice and brought peace to his lands for nearly 14 years. After his death, the kingdom faced an interregnum of 5 months as nobles struggled to agree upon a new ruler. At last, the powerful party of Narbonne in Gothic Gaul succeeded in raising Luva, also known as Luva or Leova, to the throne. Luva chose to rule only Gothic Gaul, and in the second year of his reign, entrusted the sovereignty of Spain to his brother Luvagild, also called Leovigild. Of Luva himself, little else is known except that he died 3 years after his election, leaving his brother as the sole ruler of the vast Gothic kingdom. Thus, as kings rose and fell, and daughters became queens only to meet betrayal, the weary lands of Spain continued to drift through shadows of conquest and faith, ever waiting for a ruler who might bring lasting peace. The reign of Luvagild shines with far greater interest than that of the kings who came before him. His rule was marked by triumph and power in all directions. His armies struck fear into their enemies, and once again the Roman soldiers were forced to retreat, seeking refuge behind the walls of their coastal fortresses. Even the fierce and independent people of Biscay, Alava, and the rugged mountains of Cantabria were humbled before him, surrendering without hope of resistance. Yet, for all his victories on the battlefield, Luvagild's most painful and heartbreaking struggle came not from foreign foes, but from within his own family, from his beloved eldest son, Ermenegild. It was a tragic conflict, for few sons had been treated with such love and generosity by their fathers. When Ermenegild married the noble princess Ingunda, daughter of the famous Brunhild and King Sigebert, the marriage was celebrated with great splendor in Toledo in the year 582. In honor of this union, Luvagild shared his royal dignity with Ermenegild, treating him with utmost honor and giving him wealth and power beyond measure. But there was a shadow within the palace walls. Ingunda, the young bride, was a devoted follower of the Orthodox faith, while Gosvinda, Luvagild's second wife, was a fierce defender of Arianism. The two queens could not bear each other's presence. Their bitterness turned the palace into a place of scandal and insult, and soon the two husbands decided it was best to part their courts. Luvagild remained in Toledo, while Ermenegild moved to Seville, where his new court soon rivaled his father's in grandeur and splendor. It was in Seville that Ermenegild's life changed forever. Under the gentle yet unwavering influence of his wife, he abandoned Arianism and embraced the Catholic faith. But his father saw this conversion not as a noble act of conscience, but as treason. Luvagild declared with sorrowful anger that the crown of the Goths would never rest upon the head of an apostate. No one knows for certain who drew the sword first in the war that followed, the grieving father or the defiant son, but many believe that it was Ermenegildo who took up arms against his father's authority. As his forces weakened and his hopes faded, the defeated prince took sanctuary within a church. From there, with fear and regret in his heart, he pleaded for his father's forgiveness. Liuvigildo, torn between his kingly duty and a father's love, promised to spare Ermenegildo's life if he left the sanctuary. Recared, Ermenegildo's brother, acted with honor and gentleness in this sad time. He persuaded Ermenegildo to leave the safety of the church and throw himself upon his father's mercy. When Ermenegildo came before him, humbled and weeping, Liuvigildo lifted his son, kissed him, and himself wept with sorrow. For some time, the father within him fought with the kingly duty in his heart. But at last, Liuvigildo ordered that Ermenegildo be stripped of his royal ornaments and titles. His punishment was exile to Valencia, where he was forced to live out his days no longer as a prince, but as an ordinary man, far from the throne he once dreamed of. Thus, beneath the shining victories of Liuvigildo's reign lay the silent tears of a father's broken heart and the bitter memory of a son who chose faith over his father's crown. Had the story ended with Ermenegildo's exile, perhaps history would have judged Liuvigildo with fairness, seeing in him a father who showed mercy despite betrayal and a king who upheld justice without cruelty. Ermenegildo himself would have been remembered simply as a misguided rebel, never praised for virtues he did not truly possess. But fate chose a darker path. Ermenegildo had barely settled into his exile when he again turned his heart against his father and his country. Restless and defiant, he sought out the Greeks, the sworn enemies of Spain, known for their cunning and treachery. With their support, he began to plot once more, stirring rebellion among the native people. Soon, leading this combined force of Greeks and rebels, he launched a sudden attack into the lands of Extremadura. Imagine the deep indignation that filled Liuvigildo's heart upon hearing of his son's betrayal for the second time. Without delay, he gathered his loyal and battle-hardened troops, ready to crush this rising threat. Another tragic campaign unfolded, pitting father against son in a battle neither truly desired. In the end, Ermenegildo was captured and taken as a prisoner to the dungeons of Tarragona. His dreams of power and freedom ended in chains. From his palace, Liuvigildo sent many trusted messengers to speak with his captive son. It is said that the king, torn between love and anger, promised not only to spare Ermenegildo's life, but to restore his royal honor if only he would abandon his Catholic faith and return to Arianism. But Ermenegildo stood firm. With a courage that even his enemies could not deny, he refused both threats and promises, declaring that he would live and die within the Catholic communion. Liuvigildo's sorrow turned to rage. In a fit of ungovernable fury, he gave the order that his son be put to death. The command was carried out swiftly and without mercy. The executioners hurried to the cold, silent dungeon where Ermenegildo lay captive, and there, in the darkness of his cell, a single blow of the hatchet ended the life of the prince of the Goths. Thus, the life of Ermenegildo came to a tragic close, not on the battlefield nor in exile, but by his father's command, leaving behind a legacy of rebellion, faith, and sorrow, forever etched into the silent stones of Tarragona's prison walls. Though the crimes of Ermenegildo were grave and deserving of punishment, there remains a sorrow that pierces the heart of any listener, for nature itself shudders at the thought of a father becoming the executioner of his own child. No matter how just the cause, Liuvigildo's memory remains forever shadowed by this act, and history can find no excuse strong enough to shield him from the judgment of posterity. Yet, as harsh as his punishment was, it is also true that Ermenegildo cannot rightly be called a martyr. Still, the question arises, what are we to think of Saint Ermenegildo as he is now known? What of the daring voices that chose to raise a rebellious and misguided youth to a rank almost divine? The Spanish Church's breviary and some ancient chroniclers tell strange and wondrous tales. They write that on the night of his execution, Ermenegildo's dark dungeon was filled with a celestial light. Angels, they say, hovered above his lifeless body, singing holy songs to honor his death. They also speak of miracles performed through his intercession. And though many of these claims arose in the unlit depths of the Middle Ages, an age of darkness so deep in Spain that it could almost be felt, they did not end there. Morales, a writer from as late as the end of the 16th century, recorded solemnly that a great miracle had been performed through the power of this precious saint. Even Mazdu, a thoughtful historian writing in the 18th century, could not fully free himself from these shadows of his country's faith, nor dared to question them openly. After news of Ermenegild's death reached his wife Ingunda's brothers, they armed themselves in righteous anger, ready to avenge their widowed sister. At the same time, the Suevi grew restless once more, preparing to descend from their mountain homes in Galicia onto the fertile plains of central Spain. But Luvagild was not a king who slept in times of danger. With swift decision, he marched to crush these rebellious vassals, determined to end their independence forever. Meanwhile, he sent his son Reccared north into Gaul to repel the advancing Franks. Both campaigns ended in victory. The Suevi were defeated completely, and their rule in Galicia was ended at last, 177 years after they first arrived in Spain. Reccared II achieved great success, driving the Franks out of Gothic Gaul and restoring peace to the northern lands. Luvagild now stood as undisputed master of the whole Iberian Peninsula, save only for a few coastal fortresses still held by the Greeks. Yet, despite all his victories and achievements, his fame was stained by his persecution of the Catholic faithful, which cast a shadow over his glorious reign. He was the first Visigothic king to be depicted on ancient coins wearing the royal diadem, a mark of his pride and power. But his wealth was not spent only on pomp and luxury. The city of Rhocopolis, which he founded in Celtiberia to honor his son Reccared, remains a monument to his patriotism and vision, and so too were the wise improvements he made to the kingdom's laws, which strengthened the nation he ruled with an iron yet determined hand. Thus, the reign of Luvagild stands in history as a story of brilliance darkened by sorrow, of triumph, faith, rebellion, and the terrible burden of a crown. Luvagild's long and eventful reign came to its end in the year 586. Just a year before his death, he had raised his son to share in his royal dignity, ensuring a smooth succession and the continuation of his powerful lineage. Yet, among Spaniards, there is one final detail that overshadows even his victories and laws: a quiet rumor that, in the last days of his life, Luvagild converted to the Catholic faith. Though history holds this conversion as uncertain, it remains a matter of deep pride for many, who find comfort in believing that the mighty king abandoned Arianism before breathing his last. If this change of faith were beyond all doubt, perhaps history would speak no more of his harshness or his bitter deeds. All his flaws and cruelties would be hidden gently under the forgiving veil of orthodoxy, leaving only the image of a great king who died in the embrace of the true faith. Thus ended the life of Luvagild, a life of triumphs and sorrows, justice and cruelty, power and repentance, leaving behind a kingdom stronger than it had ever been before. When Luvagild passed away, his son Reccared was immediately and unanimously recognized as the sole king of the Goths. Barely a year into his reign, Reccared conceived a bold and far-reaching vision. He wished to reclaim his people from the heresy of Arianism and guide them back to the Catholic faith. Such a task, he knew, required not only courage, but also wisdom, patience, and careful strategy. Reccared began by inviting both Catholic and Arian prelates to come together and debate before him. He listened to their arguments with a calm and impartial manner, creating an atmosphere of fairness and respect. In truth, this was the first step in his grand plan, for by doing so, he laid the foundation for the change he deeply desired. But soon, he took an even bolder step. In a gesture that showed his true intentions, Reccared restored to the Catholic churches all the treasures and wealth that had been taken from them by his father and earlier kings. Moreover, he granted additional revenues to the poorer churches, winning their loyalty and gratitude. When he felt that the time was right and his preparations complete, Reccared summoned his nobles and clergy to a great council at Toledo on May 8th, 587. Before beginning, he asked the assembly to spend 3 full days in fasting and prayer, seeking divine guidance for what lay ahead. Finally, standing before them, Reccared spoke with eloquence and gravity. He explained that if unity of religion could be restored, it would bring an end to the troubles and divisions that had long disturbed the peace of the kingdom. Then, with great solemnity, he ordered an instrument to be read aloud. It contained his own abjuration of Arianism and his confession of faith in the Holy Trinity, declaring his belief in the co-equality of the three divine persons and his submission to the authority of the Catholic and Apostolic Church. When Ricard and his queen had signed this act of confession, a powerful silence filled the council chamber. One by one, inspired by their king's courage and devotion, the prelates and nobles came forward to sign their names alongside his. Thus, in that historic moment, the Catholic faith was declared the religion of the Visigothic state. Spaniard, Sueve, and Goth were united in one holy communion. At the suggestion of Saint Leander and King Ricard, with the agreement of all present, a new canon was also established. From that day onward, no one would be permitted to receive the Lord's Supper unless they first recited the Creed as sanctioned by the Council of Constantinople. Through wisdom, faith, and a brave heart, Ricard I brought spiritual unity to his kingdom, a moment that would forever shape the soul of Spain. Scarcely had Ricard completed the momentous conversion of his people to the Catholic faith when new challenges rose before him. In 589, he was called upon to defend his territories in southern Gaul from an invasion by Gontram, king of the Franks. Near the ancient city of Carcassonne, Ricard's forces met the Franks in a fierce and decisive battle. His general led the Gothic troops to a resounding victory. The enemy was utterly routed, their camp captured, and 9,000 Frankish warriors lay lifeless upon the field. This triumph not only secured his kingdom's borders, but also strengthened his reputation as a ruler who was blessed with both courage and divine favor. But his victories did not end there. The Basques, with their restless spirit and fierce independence, had long been a thorn in the side of neighboring provinces, launching raids and defying Gothic authority. Ricard led his armies against them, subduing their resistance and bringing peace to the troubled northern regions. He also turned his might against the imperial forces who still held fortresses within Spain. These proud remnants of Roman power were humbled by his campaigns, forced to retreat behind their walls and abandon their ambitions of expansion. Throughout the rest of his reign, Ricard devoted himself to the welfare of his people. His administration brought an age of remarkable prosperity, and he ruled with such wisdom and justice that he earned the deep confidence and love of his subjects. It has often been said of this noble king that there was no war he did not win, no rebellion he did not suppress, and no conspiracy he did not uncover. As his life neared its end, Ricard showed a devotion that touched the hearts of all who knew him. During his final illness, he followed the ancient practices of the early church and made a public confession of his sins, seeking forgiveness with humility and faith. Thus, in the year 601, the great Ricard I passed away, a king remembered not only for his victories in battle, but also for the peace, unity, and faith he brought to his kingdom. The period that followed the death of Ricard I was marked by rulers who brought little glory or greatness to the Visigothic throne. From 601 to 672 AD, 11 monarchs rose and fell, yet few left behind any deeds worthy of remembrance. Their reigns were often short, and their actions so insignificant that history barely took notice. Louva II, the eldest son and successor of Ricard, had scarcely ruled for 2 years before he was assassinated. His murderer was none other than Witteric, a man whom Ricard himself had once spared out of mercy. Yet, Witteric gained little from his treachery. His wars brought him only defeat, and his family life offered him no comfort or pride. After 7 troubled years on the throne, he too was murdered, slain at his own table, his body buried without honor, and his memory forgotten without grief. Gundamar succeeded him in 610, and proved to be more fortunate in his warlike ventures. He triumphed over the ever-restless Basques and humbled the imperialists who still held scattered strongholds in Spain. Unlike many of his predecessors, he enjoyed the rare blessing of dying a natural death, passing away in quiet dignity. Then came Sigebert, also known as Sigebert, a king of greater character and worth. His victories over both the Basques and the imperial forces were more decisive, for he not only defeated them, but also retained the fortresses he conquered. Especially important were those strongholds near the Straits of Gibraltar, which remained forever lost to the empire. Yet Sigebert's true greatness lay not in his victories, but in his humanity. He was known to weep upon seeing the wounds of prisoners, and often spent his own wealth to ransom those captured by his soldiers. When a town was taken by force, he commanded that any enemy who reached his quarters and sought his protection should be spared both life and liberty. Such mercy stood in stark contrast to the savage customs of his Gothic warriors, who were accustomed to slaughter without distinction all living souls who fell before their swords. Strangely, however, the same compassionate king turned harshly against his Jewish subjects. He issued a cruel edict that left them with no choice but forced baptism, brutal scourging, or utter ruin. 80,000 Jews, fearing for their lives, submitted to baptism, while many others fled into France to escape persecution. Those who remained steadfast in their faith suffered great cruelty. Eventually, however, the church realized the futility and wickedness of such forced conversions. The Fourth Council of Toledo declared that the holy sacraments should no longer be imposed upon unwilling hearts. In other matters, Sisebut ruled wisely and with foresight. He envisioned the fleet not only to defend Spain's shores, but also to teach his people the art of seafaring, a grand and forward-looking idea for a Gothic king. It is believed he also fortified the city of Evora, strengthening its walls for future generations. Sisebut's reign ended in 621. His son, Ricaire II, took the throne after him, but reigned for only 3 brief months before his light, too, was extinguished. Thus passed the days of these petty monarchs, kings who rose swiftly and fell silently, leaving behind them little but faint traces in the fading chronicles of time. The reigns that followed the brief rule of Ricaire II brought Spain into an era both turbulent and transformative. Suintila, who rose to the throne in 621 AD, was a ruler of curious contradictions. In the early years of his reign, he shone brightly as a monarch of rare courage and ambition. Where his predecessors had struggled and failed, Suintila triumphed. He drove out the imperialists, capturing all their remaining fortresses and forever ending their influence within the peninsula. For the first time, Spain stood united under a single Gothic crown. His victories did not end there. The fierce Basques, so long a thorn in the side of Gothic rulers, were subdued under his command. At this peak of glory, Suintila was celebrated as the greatest of his line, a king who secured his people's lands and peace. But, as often happens in the lives of men, success bred arrogance, and arrogance birthed ruin. The hours he once spent on matters of justice and the welfare of his kingdom were now lost in indulgence and sensual pleasures. His character turned harsh and cruel. What angered the proud Gothic nobles even more was his attempt to secure the throne as a hereditary right, bestowing upon his son Ricaire the title of king while he himself yet ruled. For a people who had always guarded their ancient equality, this act seemed an unforgivable betrayal. Seeing the deep resentment brewing among the Goths, a powerful noble named Sisinando seized the moment. He conspired against Suintila, and soon the king was deposed by his own people. Sisinando was proclaimed ruler in 631 AD, and his rise was blessed by the Fourth Council of Toledo in 633, where church leaders not only affirmed his kingship, but excommunicated Suintila along with his wife, children, and brother, casting them into disgrace. When Sisinando's rule ended, the Gothic nobles chose Chintilla as king. Upholding recent laws, Chintilla assembled the clergy at Toledo to confirm his election. There, the council passed a decree ensuring that no future king could ascend the throne unless he was of noble Gothic blood. They further decreed that any man who sought power through unjust means would be excommunicated, sealing his fate in disgrace. In a later council, the Sixth of Toledo, held about 18 months after, a harsher law was declared. Every future king must vow not only to uphold Catholicism, but to destroy all other forms of worship within his realm, especially the faith of that accursed people, the Jews. After Chintilla came Toga in 640 AD, a king who lived quietly, embodying gentle virtues in turbulent times. But soon, power fell into the hands of the aged and stern Chindaswind, in 642. This resolute monarch chose to associate his son Reseswind, with him in rule. When Sindaswinto died in 653, Reseswinto continued to reign, inheriting not just his father's crown, but also his favor with both church and people. Reseswinto's reign was marked by acts that pleased both the clergy and the nobles. His deep piety made him beloved by the church, while his decision to declare that the personal wealth of kings should pass not to their children but to their successors won the approval of the powerful Gothic lords, ever wary of royal dynasties becoming too strong. Thus, through these decades, Spain was shaped by rulers who rose in might and fell into shadows, leaving behind a kingdom forged in triumph, betrayal, devotion, and fear, a land ever shifting under the weight of its own history. After the death of Resuswinto in the year 672 AD, the eyes of the Gothic electors turned with hope towards Wamba. This man's wisdom, honor, and virtues were well known throughout the kingdom. He had served in the highest offices with dignity and justice, and all believed he would bring stability to a troubled land. But Wamba himself did not share their eagerness. Having spent much of his life in the demanding halls of power, he had learned that greatness rarely brings true happiness. He felt the weight of his years upon him and saw in kingship not glory, but a burden too heavy for his aging shoulders. Again and again he declined their offer, insisting that his advanced age made him unfit to rule a kingdom needing strength and constant labor. His refusals brought tears and pleas from the nobles, yet he remained firm. Finally, in desperation, one of the dukes of the palace pressed a dagger against his chest and spoke coldly. He must choose between the grave or the throne. Faced with death or duty, Wamba could refuse no more, and thus, reluctantly, he accepted the crown. His fears about popular fickleness soon proved well-founded. No sooner had he ascended the throne than rebellion shook his realm. The Basques rose in revolt, as was often their nature. Their defiance inspired the inhabitants of Gothic Gaul to throw off obedience as well. At the same time, Wamba's strict religious policies added fuel to the flames. His decree, demanding that all Jews convert to Christianity or face banishment, drove many desperate exiles into open rebellion. They gathered in Nimes, where Count Hilderic, a powerful lord, had already stirred up nobles and bishops against the king's rule. The troubles deepened when Duke Paul, a Greek by birth, cunning, ambitious, and without scruple, was sent with an army to crush the rebels beyond the Pyrenees. Instead of quelling the revolt, Paul betrayed Wamba. With skillful deceit, he persuaded his soldiers to join the rebels and convinced fortress after fortress to surrender to his cause. Even the mighty cities of Barcelona and Narbonne turned away from their king. Thus began the reign of Wamba, with a reluctant coronation, betrayed loyalties, and a realm swiftly fragmenting beneath his weary gaze. While Wamba was occupied in subduing the Cantabrians, the cunning Greek Duke Paul wasted no time in weaving his treacherous schemes. With skillful persuasion and deceitful promises, he convinced the Goths of Gaul to proclaim him as their king. His ambition knew no bounds, but he had underestimated the resolve of the true ruler. Once Wamba had restored order in the Cantabrian lands, he turned his eyes swiftly towards Catalonia, where rebellion festered under Paul's false crown. As his army approached the borders of the province, Wamba demonstrated his strategic brilliance. He divided his powerful forces into three great divisions. One part of his army was sent by sea, while the other two advanced towards the Pyrenees along different routes, surrounding the rebels with careful precision. The city of Barcelona, upon seeing the disciplined might of Wamba's legions, surrendered almost at once without a blow being struck. Girona too offered no resistance, recognizing the futility of defying such a king. Two of Wamba's trusted generals advanced towards the fortress of Clausina, known today as Clusas. There, they swiftly captured the stronghold and took prisoner both Hilderic, the rebel count, and Ranosind, one of his principal allies. With these victories strengthening his cause, Wamba pressed forward towards Narbonne, hoping to end the rebellion entirely by capturing its chief architect, Duke Paul. But the Greek traitor, whose courage now failed him, had already fled in haste to Nîmes, leaving Narbonne under the command of Duke Witimer. Seeing no hope of holding the city against Wamba's forces, Witimer surrendered. The punishment for betrayal was severe. Duke Witimer and his fellow conspirators were publicly scourged before the people, as a stark reminder of the fate awaiting those who raised arms against their rightful king. And so, with calm determination, Wamba continued his campaign to restore peace and order in a realm torn by ambition and treachery. After securing Narbonne, Wamba wasted no time. His victorious army moved swiftly to capture other strongholds nearby, tightening his grip over the rebellious territories with unwavering resolve. His next target was Nimes, where the cunning Duke Paul had entrenched himself with his bravest and most desperate soldiers. As Wamba's forces arrived before the mighty walls of the city, they wasted no moment in launching a fierce assault. The defenders, knowing their doom if captured, fought back with equal fury. Arrows darkened the sky, and swords clashed against shields in a thunderous chorus of war cries. Eventually, the relentless might of Wamba's warriors overcame the high walls. They clambered to the top, where a terrible struggle broke out under the blazing sun. For a brief but savage moment, the summit became a battlefield of blood and courage. The defenders fell back, and the fight spilled into the narrow streets of Nimes. But still, the sword of the Goths swept through, leaving no corner untouched by their victory. At last, Wamba entered Nimes in triumph. The weary inhabitants, relieved to see the terrible siege ended, received him with sincere gratitude despite their earlier resistance. Then came the fate of the traitors. By the king's command, Duke Paul and the other leading rebels were dragged by their hair from the dark vaults of the ancient amphitheater where they had cowered in fear. The royal judges quickly gathered to pass sentence. Many demanded death for such high treason, but Wamba, though firm, showed his mercy. He spared their lives. Instead, he ordered that they should have their heads shaven as a mark of disgrace, and that they be confined within the religious walls of Toledo for the remainder of their days. His campaign in Gothic Gaul now complete, Wamba deposed certain governors who had failed their duty, appointed wiser and braver men in their place, and ordered the damaged towns to be repaired. And with firm resolve, he banished the Jews from these lands, enforcing his laws as king and guardian of his realm. With peace restored, justice served, and his authority re-established, Wamba returned at last to his capital, where his people awaited him with hope and awe, for they knew no king had defended their kingdom with such courage and wisdom in many years. After his glorious victories, King Wamba turned his heart and mind towards the true welfare of his people. No longer distracted by rebellion or war, he poured his energy into building a kingdom of strength and peace. He encouraged learning and the arts, ensuring that the clergy remained diligent in their sacred duties, while he worked tirelessly to improve the daily lives of his subjects. Under his reign, Toledo's mighty walls were strengthened to stand against any future foe. Justice was administered with a rare wisdom firm where it needed to be, yet always softened with mercy. Wamba's character shone with incorruptible integrity. His zeal for his country's good burned bright, yet was balanced by moderation and calm judgment, and his prudence was unmatched, for he planned not only for his own lifetime, but for the unseen dangers that lay ahead. He foresaw with startling clarity the threat rising across the southern seas. The Saracens, driven by a fierce and restless faith, would one day cast their eyes upon Spain. So Wamba ordered the creation of a great fleet to guard the coast. His caution soon proved its worth. Around the year 677, a fleet of 170 Saracen barks passed through the Straits of Gibraltar, hoping to seize the lands of the Goths. But Wamba's navy was ready. His ships met them with unflinching might, scattering their fleet, capturing many vessels, and forcing the rest to flee in terror. Thus, though the Saracens ruled nearly all of northern Africa, from the Nile's waters to the far Atlantic shores, they dared not disturb the lands of the wise and vigilant Wamba for many years. Had the kings who followed him shown the same foresight and strength, Spain might never have suffered under the cruel yoke of Saracen domination, the greatest scourge that ever fell upon her people. Yet, even such a mighty ruler could not escape the dark fate that so often awaited Visigothic kings. His downfall came not through battle, nor from an enemy's sword, but from within. On a quiet Sunday, the 14th of October, 680, Wamba fell suddenly into a deep insensibility. His servants, believing him near death, hurried to perform the rituals of his passing. They shaved his head and clothed him in the garments of penitence, transforming their king into a monk, as was the custom in such moments. But within a day, Wamba awoke. Though his body revived, his destiny did not. For in that age, once a man had received the monastic vow 7 unwillingly, he was forever bound by them. Thus, deprived of his crown and of all royal duties, the great Wamba retired quietly to the monastery of Pampliega near Burgos. There he spent the final days of his life in prayer and solitude, far from the throne he had ruled with such wisdom, courage, and care. Such are the facts of this strange and sorrowful event. Yet, behind these bare details lies a question that history may never fully answer. Was Wamba's sudden loss of life and power a natural misfortune, or the shadowy result of careful treachery? Two chroniclers writing in the 9th century, Sebastian of Salamanca and an anonymous monk from Albelda boldly accuse Ervigius, a nephew of the old king Sindaswinto. They claim Ervigius, driven by a secret, burning ambition to claim the throne for himself, prepared a potent draft for Wamba. This potion, they say, was strong enough to darken reason, if not to still life itself. In the deep lethargy that followed, the helpless king was shaved and robed in monastic garb. Whether this act of tonsure was carried out by Ervigius's command, or simply by the pious zeal of attendants who thought their lord dying, remains forever uncertain. Yet these accusations raise another question. Can the words of these chroniclers be trusted? They wrote long after Wamba's fall more than a century had passed, and memory is easily colored by rumor and legend. Contemporary voices say nothing of this treason. St. Julian, who lived at that very time, leaves not a single hint of such dark deeds in his writings. The 12th Council of Toledo, convened soon after Wamba's retirement, makes no mention of foul play. Even Isidore of Badajoz, writing 70 years later, offers no accusation. In truth, no chronicler of Wamba's own age placed this stain on Ervigius's name. Indeed, when Ervigius took the crown, he presented 3 formal documents to the people and the church. The first, signed by the great officers of the palace, confirmed that Wamba had received the tonsure and monastic habit. The second, signed in Wamba's own hand, contained his solemn renunciation of the throne in favor of Ervigius. The third was an order from Wamba, addressed to the Metropolitan Bishop of Toledo, commanding him to crown his appointed successor. But doubt remains. Some argue that the silence of St. Julian and the Council Fathers does not prove Ervigius's innocence, but rather reveals their fear. Who among them would dare accuse a king who now held the scepter of the Goths? As for those carefully prepared documents, does their very perfection not suggest hidden anxiety? Would innocence go to such lengths to forge an unbreakable chain of proof? Does not such elaborate caution betray a mind haunted by suspicion of its own guilt? Moreover, Ervigius's later conduct does, we shall soon see revealed, a nature capable of dark deeds, lending weight to the accusations of treachery. Yet here, where absolute truth has long been buried beneath the dust of centuries, the wise will remain cautious in judgment, and the good will refrain from condemning with certainty what only God himself can know. After Wamba's mysterious removal, Ervigius swiftly summoned a council at Toledo 12th held within those ancient walls. Before the assembled bishops and nobles, he presented the 3 documents that justified his sudden elevation. With little hesitation, the council fathers declared the instruments authentic and proclaimed Ervigius rightful king of the Visigoths. Yet their blind submission to his will cast a shadow on their integrity and insulted the memory of their former sovereign, a ruler whose virtues the people still mourned. But Ervigius, skilled in the arts of intrigue, saw that the hearts of his subjects remained loyal to Wamba. Determined to strengthen his hold on power, he devised a cunning plan. To tarnish Wamba's reputation and win over those who had rebelled under Duke Paul, he convened yet another assembly, 13th Council of Toledo. There, he urged the bishops to reverse Wamba's firm but just decrees. Obedient to their king, the fathers passed a canon restoring honors, lands, and rights to all who had once raised their swords against Wamba. Thus, rebels were forgiven, and the foundations of discipline crumbled. Yet, despite these measures, Ervigius's fear would not sleep. He knew that his crown rested on fragile loyalties. Seeking to protect his line, he called forth Ergica, Wamba's Nephwa, prince of noble descent and wide repute. Offering him the hand of his daughter in marriage, Ervigius demanded but one oath in return, that Ergica would safeguard his wife's family when Ervigius himself lay in the tomb. To this, the ambitious prince readily agreed. Their marriage was solemnized with royal splendor, and, upon Ervigius's death, the diadem of the Goths passed peacefully to Ergica. Yet gratitude, history teaches, rarely finds a lasting home in royal hearts. No sooner did Ergica ascend the throne than he turned against the memory of his benefactor. Summoning the 15th Council of Toledo, he laid before the bishops his dilemma. How could he uphold his sworn promise to protect Ervigius's family when the people clamored against their greed and tyranny? The pliant council, ever ready to bend to royal wishes, declared that an oath taken in injustice was no oath at all. The king, they decreed, was free to punish or reward as his conscience directed, even against the house of Ervigius. Thus sanctioned, Ergica struck swiftly, He punished the partisans of his late father-in-law with unflinching severity. Nor did he stop there. To sever the final bond tying him to the fallen dynasty, he repudiated his wife, casting her aside and dissolving the alliance that had once secured his path to power. Such was the bitter fate of Ervigius's line, undone by the very prince who had sworn to protect it. And thus Gothic Spain continued, its kings weaving webs of alliance and betrayal in a realm where thrones were won not by birthright alone, but by cunning hearts and iron hands. Witiza, 709 AD. Yet even such a mighty ruler could not escape the dark fate that so often awaited Visigothic kings. His downfall came not through battle, nor from an enemy's sword, but from within. On a quiet Sunday, the 14th of October, 680, Wamba fell suddenly into a deep insensibility. His servants, believing him near death, hurried to perform the rituals of his passing. They shaved his head and clothed him in the garments of penitence, transforming their king into a monk, as was the custom in such moments. But within a day, Wamba awoke. Though his body revived, his destiny did not. For in that age, once a man had received the monastic vow 7 unwillingly, he was forever bound by them. Thus, deprived of his crown and of all royal duties, the great Wamba retired quietly to the monastery of Pamplega near Burgos. There he spent the final days of his life in prayer and solitude, far from the throne he had ruled with such wisdom, courage, and care. Such are the facts of this strange and sorrowful event. Yet, behind these bare details lies a question that history may never fully answer. Was Wamba's sudden loss of life and power a natural misfortune, or the shadowy result of careful treachery? Two chroniclers writing in the 9th century, Sebastian of Salamanca, and an anonymous monk from Albo de Boldly, accuse Ervigius, a nephew of the old king Sindasuinto. They claim Ervigius, driven by a secret burning ambition to claim the throne for himself, prepared a potent draught for Wamba. This potion, they say, was strong enough to darken reason, if not to still life itself. In the deep lethargy that followed, the helpless king was shaved and robed in monastic garb. Whether this act of tonsure was carried out by Ervigius's command or simply by the pious zeal of attendants who thought their lord dying remains forever uncertain. Yet these accusations raise another question. Can the words of these chroniclers be trusted? They wrote long after Wamba's fall more than a century had passed, and memory is easily colored by rumor and legend. Contemporary voices say nothing of this treason. Saint Julian, who lived at that very time, leaves not a single hint of such dark deeds in his writings. The 12th Council of Toledo, convened soon after Wamba's retirement, makes no mention of foul play. Even Isidore of Badajoz, writing 70 years later, offers no accusation. In truth, no chronicler of Wamba's own age placed this stain on Ervigius's name. Indeed, when Ervigius took the crown, he presented 3 formal documents to the people and the church. The first, signed by the great officers of the palace, confirmed that Wamba had received the tonsure and monastic habit. The second, signed in Wamba's own hand, contained his solemn renunciation of the throne in favor of Ervigius. The third was an order from Wamba, addressed to the Metropolitan Bishop of Toledo, commanding him to crown his appointed successor. But doubt remains. Some argue that the silence of St. Julian and the Council Fathers does not prove Ervigius's innocence, but rather reveals their fear. Who among them would dare accuse a king who now held the scepter of the Goths? As for those carefully prepared documents, does their very perfection not suggest hidden anxiety? Would innocents go to such lengths to forge an unbreakable chain of proof? Does not such elaborate caution betray a mind haunted by suspicion of its own guilt? Moreover, Ervigius's later conductas, we shall soon see revealed a nature capable of dark deeds, lending weight to the accusations of treachery. Yet here, where absolute truth has long been buried beneath the dust of centuries, the wise will remain cautious in judgment, and the good will refrain from condemning with certainty what only God himself can know. After Wamba's mysterious removal, Ervigius swiftly summoned a council at Toledo the 12th, held within those ancient walls. Before the assembled bishops and nobles, he presented the 3 documents that justified his sudden elevation. With little hesitation, the Council Fathers declared the instruments authentic and proclaimed Ervigius rightful king of the Visigoths. Yet their blind submission to his will cast a shadow on their integrity and insulted the memory of their former sovereign, a ruler whose virtues the people still mourned. But Ervigius, skilled in the arts of intrigue, saw that the hearts of his subjects remained loyal to Wamba. Determined to strengthen his hold on power, he devised a cunning plan. To tarnish Wamba's reputation and win over those who had rebelled under Duke Paul, he convened yet another assembly, 13th Council of Toledo. There, he urged the bishops to reverse Wamba's firm but just decrees. Obedient to their king, the fathers passed a canon restoring honors, lands, and rights to all who had once raised their swords against Wamba. Thus, rebels were forgiven, and the foundations of discipline crumbled. Yet, despite these measures, Ervigius's fear would not sleep. He knew that his crown rested on fragile loyalties. Seeking to protect his line, he called forth Ergica, Wamba's Nephwa prince of noble descent and wide repute. Offering him the hand of his daughter in marriage, Ervigius demanded but one oath in return, that Ergica would safeguard his wife's family when Ervigius himself lay in the tomb. To this, the ambitious prince readily agreed. Their marriage was solemnized with royal splendor, and, upon Ervigius's death, the diadem of the Goths passed peacefully to Ergica. Yet gratitude, history teaches, rarely finds a lasting home in royal hearts. No sooner did Ergica ascend the throne than he turned against the memory of his benefactor. Summoning the 15th Council of Toledo, he laid before the bishops his dilemma. How could he uphold his sworn promise to protect Ervigius's family when the people clamored against their greed and tyranny? The pliant council, ever ready to bend to royal wishes, declared that an oath taken in injustice was no oath at all. The king, they decreed, was free to punish or reward as his conscience directed even against the house of Ervigius. Thus sanctioned, Ergica struck swiftly. He punished the partisans of his late father-in-law with unflinching severity, nor did he stop there. To sever the final bond tying him to the fallen dynasty, he repudiated his wife, casting her aside and dissolving the alliance that had once secured his path to power. Such was the bitter fate of Ervigius's line, undone by the very prince who had sworn to protect it. And thus, Gothic Spain continued, its kings weaving webs of alliance and betrayal in a realm where thrones were won not by birthright alone, but by cunning hearts and iron hands. Witiza, 700 to 709 AD. Thus, as time rolled on, Witiza's reputation blackened further with each retelling. Generations of priests and historians shaped his story into a moral lesson, adding detail upon damning detail until his reign seemed an age of unbroken corruption. Perhaps some of these tales hold grains of truth. Perhaps they were born from later zeal, seeking to explain why God had delivered Gothic Spain into the hands of invaders. In the end, Witiza remains a king half seen through legends, murky veils, real deeds buried beneath the centuries of reproach that followed his fall. Another chronicler of the same age spoke not of Witiza's supposed orgies or his war against the church, but instead accused him of far darker political crimes, murdering the father of the famed Pelayo and relentlessly pursuing Pelayo himself. As centuries passed, these accusations only grew in horror. 200 years later, the monk of Silos added that Witiza, driven by jealousy, ordered the eyes gouged out of a noble prince. Another 200 years, and Lucas Tudensis wove an even grimmer tapestry. He claimed that Witiza, fearing rebellion, disarmed every subject in his realm and tore down the walls of every city but 3. He banished Bishop Julian from Toledo to replace him with his own son, Apis. He even, according to Tudensis, mutilated the son of King Sindaswinto out of spite. Yet, when these claims are examined, they crumble beneath the weight of time's distortions. There was no Bishop Julian at that period. Oppas was not Witiza's son, and the supposed son of King Sindaswinto, whom Witiza was said to have envied, would have been more than 80 years old by Athena, feeble rival indeed. It was during this period of storytelling that Roderick Ximenes, a chronicler eager to reconcile conflicting accounts, devised a clever solution. He read of the early chronicles praising Witiza's justice and the later annals damning him as a monster. To unite these extremes, he suggested that Witiza began as a noble ruler, but then plunged suddenly into corruption and vice. This patchwork narrative pleased later historians, and so Morales, Mariana, Ferreras, and Ashbach all preserved it, depicting a king who fell from grace into ruin. Modern historians, however, cast doubt upon these dark portrayals. Many argue that Witiza's supposed evils were fictions born of the hatred of church chroniclers who despised him for shielding the Jews and resisting ecclesiastical control. In truth, his story reveals how history and legend grow so intertwined that even diligent scholars struggle to separate them. As for Witiza's end, little is certain. A rebellion rose against him, and power was soon shared or seized by Roderick, who was called the son of King Sindasuinto, though he was more likely merely descended from that line. One story claims that Roderick, aided by Greek allies, finally captured Witiza and blinded him. Yet, of such a dramatic fate, the contemporary historian Isidorus Pacensis says nothing. All that is known is that by 709, Roderick ruled Spain alone. This Roderick, the last of the Goths, is himself half shrouded in legend. Some modern scholars such as Don even dismiss him as an historical phantom, invented by generations hungry for a tragic final king. And what of the most famous legend of all the tale of Florinda? Her beauty, so the story says, inflamed Roderick's desire, and her father's wrath called the Arabs across the sea to seize Spain in vengeance. Though historians reject the miraculous flourishes of this romancy enchanted Tower of Hercules, with its prophetic inscriptions warning of Arab conquest, the core of the tale remains strangely plausible. It speaks of betrayal, desire, and revenge, woven forever into the memory of a land on the edge of its greatest fall. Thus ends the dim, uncertain saga of Witiza, a ruler whose true deeds may be forever lost beneath centuries of fear, piety, legend, and whispered blame. The fable of Roderick and Florinda, 709-711 A.D., in the later chronicles of Spain, woven from fading memory and bright imagination, there appears the haunting tale of Florinda, known to some as La Cava. She was, they say, the most beautiful among the noble ladies who adorned King Roderick's court. Whether daughter or wife of Count Julianor Don Ilin, as some versions name him, her lineage was as noble as her face was fair. But beauty in a royal court is often perilous. Roderick, king of the Goths, beheld her with eyes burning not with honor but with desire. He wooed her with whispered promises and rich gifts, yet her virtue proved as unyielding as it was radiant. Florinda rejected his advances, guarding her honor fiercely. However, kings, and least of all Gothic kings, were not accustomed to refusal. Thus, when persuasion failed, Roderick's will turned to force. In silence and agony, Florinda bore her ruin, concealing her hatred until her father returned from his campaigns against the Moors. When Count Julian learned of the outrage inflicted upon his daughter, his grief flamed into wrath. No private vengeance would suffice to cleanse the dishonor brought upon his house. He resolved upon a retribution so vast that it would shake the world. Concealing his purpose under courteous words, he came to Toledo and retrieved Florinda from the king's court. His bearing was so gracious that Roderick suspected nothing of the storm gathering at his doorstep. Upon returning to Ceuta, Count Julian moved swiftly. He sent messengers to the Moors, offering them what they long coveted, a gateway into Spain. In exchange, he demanded that they destroy the king who had violated his child. The Moors, eager for conquest, prepared their fleets. Julian, abandoning his people and faith, guided their sails across the narrow sea, landing with Tariq ibn Ziyad at Gibraltar. Thus began the fateful invasion that would sweep away centuries of Gothic rule and forge the dawn of Islamic Spain. Yet, like many tragic legends, the tale of Florinda is steeped more in romance than in sober history. Its first mention comes from the monk of Silos, writing 400 years after the Arabs crossed the straits. Many scholars believe it an Arabic invention, crafted to explain the ease with which the Moors conquered a kingdom thought strong and proud. The memory of a king's lustful sin served as a convenient moral lesson for both Christian and Muslim chroniclers, that betrayal and immorality at the highest levels bring doom upon a nation. The romanticized chronicle of Don Roderick spins the story further, imagining every whispered word and secret glance. In that chivalric poem, Roderick himself believes Florinda's resistance was merely the modesty of maidenhood, her heart yielding though her lips refused. Even when he forced himself upon her, it is said she remained silent, fearing her cries might reach the queen's ears and bring shame upon them both. Centuries later, English poet Robert Southey cast Florinda as a paragon of virtue, while portraying Roderick not as a monster but as a tragic king, torn between sin and destiny. In his telling, their fates are interwoven with sorrowful, grandeur-flawed mortals, trapped in a drama beyond their power to escape. Whether myth or memory, the story of Florinda and Roderick endures as the mournful prelude to Spain's greatest transformation, the fall of the Visigothic kingdom and the rising crescent of Al-Andalus upon Iberian soil. Visigothic civilization, 415–711 AD. At first glance, the government of the Visigoths might appear to have been an absolute monarchy where the king's will was law. Yet in truth, the king's power was far from unlimited. Over time, the might of the monarch came to be restrained not only by the fierce independence of the Gothic nobles, but also perhaps even more powerfully by the influence of the church. Thus, their kingdom might more accurately be called a theocracy, ruled jointly by crown and mitre. In the early days, Gothic kings were not distant, godlike sovereigns, but rather the foremost among equals, primi inter pares. They boasted no ancient royal bloodline, no hereditary majesty set apart from the warrior chiefs around them. Each noble, clad in his armor, felt himself the king's equant. If fortune and strength favored him, he could become king in his turn. Their titles, however, were rich in grandeur. Your glory was the standard form of address, while epithets like pious or conquering adorned their names in chronicles and proclamations. It was Reccared who first adopted the name Flavius, though whether he took it from the Roman imperial family to enhance his prestige or from its supposed Gothic meaning, historians cannot say. What is certain is that the name became a permanent mark of Visigothic royalty thereafter. His father, Leovigild, was the first to bring regal splendor to their courts, having his likeness minted with a crowned head, declaring to all the rising dignity of the Gothic monarchy. Those who followed expanded these symbols of authority. They wore robes dyed in imperial purple, sat upon thrones of silver, and bore scepters and crowns of gold. Especially from the reign of King Sindesuinto onwards, these visible trappings of kingship grew ever more magnificent, drawing clear lines between ruler and ruled in a society where nobility had once been a band of comrades in arms. Still, two restrictions checked the monarch's power after the Visigoths settled in Toledo. First, the king could not condemn any man without a proper legal trial. Yet, once judged, he alone could temper justice's severity or grant complete pardon. Second, his decrees were binding during his life, but if they were to endure beyond his reign and become part of the kingdom's enduring law, they needed the approval and signatures of the bishops and barons gathered in council. Beyond these two checks, the king's power was broad indeed. He could wage war or conclude peace at his discretion. His proclamations carried the force of law, subject only to council ratification for permanence. In times of war, he personally commanded the armies. In times of peace, he presided over the courts of justice. Remarkably, his authority extended deeply into religious life. Kings issued general regulations concerning church discipline and spiritual affairs. They presided over ecclesiastical appeals, and in time, the prerogative to appoint bishops once purely clerical fell into royal hands. Indeed, monarchs even translated bishops from one diocese to another to suit political needs, though this power was secured only gradually over generations. Finally, it was the king alone who could summon national councils of the church, and it was only with his approval that their decisions gained binding force. In this unique fusion of royal and spiritual authority, the king stood as the supreme protector of the church in a manner unmatched by any other Catholic nation in Europe. In return, bishops became courtiers as well as shepherds, often bending to the monarch's will. Even the solemn assemblies of the famous councils of Toledo, which crafted laws and guarded doctrine, were not free from royal influence. Fear of displeasing the crowner, the hope of gaining its favor silently guided many of their decisions. Thus emerged a Visigothic civilization ruled by a warrior king crowned in gold and purple, but held firm in the twin restraints of noble pride and ecclesiastical power, a kingdom where sword and crozier ruled side by side until the fatal tide of conquest swept both away. In every other aspect of life, the Visigothic kings were surrounded by strict laws, ensuring outward reverence and submission from their people. Anyone who conspired against the king's life faced death without question. If, by rare mercy, the death penalty was remitted, the offender's punishment remained cruel. He would be blinded, his head shaven in humiliation, and he would spend the rest of his days in perpetual confinement, never again to see the world he once sought to control. Even insulting the king was treated with harsh severity. If the offender was wealthy, he was forced to surrender half of all his possessions. If he was poor, his fate lay entirely in the hands of the monarch, to be decided as the king saw fit. Such was the protection of royal dignity that defaming a deceased king was punishable by 50 lashes. The dead, too, were shielded by law from dishonor. Yet, despite these rigorous laws enforcing fear and respect, the lives of Visigothic kings were among the most precarious in European history. From the first king, Adolf, to the last, Roderick, a large number were either murdered or dethroned. Their crowns rested on trembling heads, never secure from the daggers and ambitions of rivals. The Goths themselves held an immense sense of national pride, which shaped their entire society. They alone were known as nobiles, the noble ones, while everyone else fell under the humiliating label of viliores. This group of viliores included not only slaves, servi, and freedmen, liberti, but even the ingenui, those who were born free yet lacked Gothic blood, regardless of their wealth, influence, or achievements. This rigid division was enforced with ruthless severity. To preserve the purity of the Gothic race, marriages between the conquerors and the conquered were strictly forbidden until the reign of King Resuscinto, who finally abolished this harsh barrier. Before him, a slave who dared to marry a free woman was executed without mercy, while the woman herself, if she had married or even sinned with a slave, was burned alive alongside him, their bodies united in death, as they were forbidden to unite in life. The laws also clearly graded punishments according to social rank. For the same crime, a free man faced a harsher penalty than a noble, and a slave suffered worse than either. Thus was the iron ladder of Visigothic society maintained, rung by rung, with the nobles always safely at the top. If we turn from civil society to the military structure of the Visigoths, we find that theirs was a kingdom of warriors. Every free man was by duty a soldier, and in their language, the words for soldier and man were almost interchangeable. Service was not optional. Even the king's own sons were not allowed to sit at their father's table until they had first proven themselves in battle, earning the right to feast with their sovereign by displaying courage and skill with the sword. Slaves, too, were drawn into this life of war. Every slave owner was required to bring into the field 1/10 of his slaves to swell the ranks of the army. Whether laymen or clergymen, all Goths who could bear arms were subject to military duty, with severe punishments meted out to anyone who dared to hide or absent himself to escape the conscription. Thus, from nobles in their golden crowns to slaves in their coarse tunics, all were bound in a grim brotherhood of arms, ready to fight and die for the kingdom whose throne was itself never safe from sudden ruin. Among the Visigoths, matrimony was not merely a sacrament. It was a sacred institution of unmatched importance, rooted deeply in their fierce pride of blood and privilege. In a society so vigilant to preserve the purity of its lineage, marriage laws were strict and unyielding. As mentioned earlier, any union between the conquering Goths and the vanquished peoples was forbidden, a barrier enforced with harsh punishment until the reign of Resuscinto finally repealed the law. A young woman could not choose her own husband. She could not even accept a suitor approved by her parents. He had to be selected by them. Should she dare to marry without their choice and consent, the consequences were brutal. Not only did she lose any claim to her share of future family wealth and prosperity, but she and her husband were condemned to slavery. They became the property of the very man her relatives had intended for her. In Visigothic tradition, the dowry was not provided by the bride's family, but by the groom himself. This dowry, however, was not handed to the bride for her own use. It was carefully preserved and managed by her guardians, reflecting the strict financial controls of their society. The laws imposed numerous impediments to matrimony, each designed to uphold social hierarchy and moral codes. 1. The man was always required to be older than the woman to establish authority and stability. 2. If either party had been previously betrothed to someone else, they could not marry another for a full 2 years. Breaking this prohibition condemned both to slavery, their freedom forfeited for their impatience. 3. If a man forced a woman, he was forever barred from marrying her. His crime severed all legitimate bond. 4. Should a Christian marry a Hebrew, both were punished with banishment, sent to different places so that neither could bring disgrace to their communities. 5. Members of monastic orders, public or devotional penitents, virgins who had taken vows and been veiled, and those related within 6 degrees of kinship were all strictly excluded from matrimony. Marriage itself was not necessarily indissoluble in practice. A couple could mutually agree to separate at any time, but once separated, they could never return to each other or remarry. Only under the gravest conditions could a marital bond be dissolved forever. If one partner committed adultery, if the husband committed the most abominable of sins, or if he forced his wife into adultery. In these cases, the law released the innocent partner entirely, granting freedom to remarry. Adultery was viewed with particular horror among the Visigoths. The punishment was severe. The guilty party became the slave of the wronged partner, their dignity and freedom forfeited in an instant. If a husband caught his wife in the very act, he was legally permitted to kill both her and her lover without facing any consequences, a grim law that reflected the depths of their belief in honor and retribution. And when guilt was suspected but not witnessed, the relentless Visigothic courts would spare no method to uncover the truth. Even torture was used to tear confessions from trembling lips, ensuring that no stain of betrayal went unpunished in a society where marriage was both a legal contract and a sacred covenant, guarded by fear, faith, and the iron hand of law. Under Visigothic rule, life for the Jews in Spain became a relentless series of hardships and humiliations. The land had never been free of religious conflict. From Roman times, heresies had woven through its spiritual history like dark threads. Nestorianism first arose, questioning the profound union of divine and human natures in Christ, but it was swiftly crushed by the vigilant guardians of orthodoxy. Manichaeans and Priscillianists soon followed, only to be banished by both Arian and Catholic rulers alike, their teachings extinguished before they could spread. But the greatest shift came after Ricard embraced Catholicism, making it the sole faith of his realm. From that moment, the Gothic kings and church councils decreed increasingly severe penalties against any who dared deviate from the established doctrine. During the reign of King Chintella, the Sixth Council of Toledo declared that no religion except Catholicism could exist within Spain's borders, and every king thereafter was compelled to swear upon his coronation that the Jews, the last visible misbelievers, would never be tolerated. Later laws deepened this harsh intolerance into a systematic persecution. Under threat of losing all property and being exiled forever, every man, whether Spanish by birth or merely a foreign resident, was forbidden from questioning anything held sacred by the Catholic and Apostolic Church. Whether it was scripture, the writings of the fathers, church decrees old or new, the sacraments, or any doctrine taught by the church, silence and submission were demanded in public and private alike. In this suffocating atmosphere, the Jews could expect neither peace nor pity. Their plight had always been fraught with danger since Roman times, but under Gothic rulers like Sisebutt, Sisinando, Chintella, Sindiswinto, Reciswinto, Wamba, and Erviges, persecution became a zealous competition. Each king sought to outdo his predecessor in cruelty and forced conversion. These rulers issued decrees mandating that all Jews must be baptized into Christianity. Those who had undergone baptism, whether willingly or under duress, were barred from employing Christian servants. They were commanded to observe Easter Sunday according to Christian rites, disregarding their own sacred calendar and beliefs. Jewish marriage laws were ignored entirely, and they were forced to accept Christian restrictions. Even their diet was violated. Whatever Christians ate, Jews were ordered to consume as well, even if their own ancient laws forbade it. Their spiritual lives were policed to the most invasive degree. No Jewish home could contain a book that contradicted Christian doctrine. In civil life, they were stripped of all power and dignity. They were barred from holding any public office, and their testimony in court was worthless unless their moral character could be vouched for by Christian witnesses. Travel became an ordeal of humiliation and fear. As they moved from town to town, they were required to carry and present an episcopal passport, declaring their faith at each checkpoint. Every Sunday, they were forced to join Christian gatherings so that their worship could be monitored and judged. They were compelled to attend catechism lessons, sitting silently as the teachings of a faith imposed upon them were repeated and explained. Thus, under the iron laws of the Visigothic kings, the Jews of Spain lived in a state of perpetual degradation, stripped of freedom, dignity, and the right to believe as their ancestors had done for centuries. enduring the crushing weight of a kingdom that saw their faith as a stain to be erased rather than a people to be protected. Despite the endless stream of oppressive laws and forced baptisms, the Visigothic kings remained deeply suspicious of their Jewish subjects. They feared that, in secret, these forced converts still clung to the faith of their ancestors. To break their spirits once and for all, the rulers devised two separate confessions of faith, each crafted with chilling precision, demanding total submission. In these confessions, the Jews were compelled to swear publicly before all who watched by invoking the great and holy name of God, the incommunicable name they held in such sacred awe. They were forced to proclaim, with every trembling word, that they utterly despised and forever renounced every ritual, custom, tradition, and sacred observance they had once cherished. They had to vow that from that moment on, they would live only within the Christian faith, acknowledging Christ as their creator and redeemer, and pledging obedience to every rite of the Catholic Church. But the humiliation did not end there. They were also required to swear that they would never again have any form of connection, friendship, or even distant contact with other Jews. They were to become isolated outcasts from their own people, cut off from every comfort of heritage and community that had sustained them through centuries of exile. These confessions were not declarations of faith. They were weapons of spiritual destruction. They tore apart families, shattered identities, and filled every Jewish heart with dread. Yet, through all these sufferings, something unbroken remained deep within their souls. And in the end, this oppressed nation found its bitter revenge. When the armies of Islam crossed into Spain, the Jews saw in them not just conquerors, but liberators from centuries of cruel tyranny. Who could blame them for welcoming the advancing Mohammedans with open arms? Who could condemn their eagerness to aid in overthrowing a kingdom that had become for them the most cursed and hateful government to ever blight the face of Europe? Imagine Spain in those days, a land blessed beyond measure. Its soil was rich and generous. Its climates varied, giving life to orchards, vineyards, and endless fields. Mighty rivers flowed through it, its coastline stretched wide, its mines held wealth beyond counting, and its people were hardy, frugal, and industrious by nature. Truly, Spain was the greatest inheritance ever entrusted to the Gothic race. And yet, despite 3 centuries of peaceful rule, their entire power crumbled in an instant. It fell forever, overtaken not by vast armies, but by a mere handful of warriors from Africa. Why did this happen? Because the Goths, blinded by arrogance and chained by ignorance, squandered every chance they were given. They despised their own advantages. They ignored every warning that fate or wise voices offered. When the time came to be measured on the scales of destiny, they were found light, wanting in courage, foresight, and wisdom. Their kingdom was taken from them because they had proven themselves unfit to hold power. Among all the systems of government humanity has ever tried, there is perhaps none so ruinous as theocracy, or to be precise, hierocracy, where priests and confessors snatch away the power that rightfully belongs to statesmen, judges, and citizens. Disaster inevitably follows. This was Spain's fate from the death of Ricaire to the fall of Roderick, a realm ruled by bishops and synods, shaken endlessly by revolutions of palace and people alike. By the dawn of the 8th century, Spain had lost nearly everything. Its industries lay silent, its commerce was stagnant, its armies neglected, and even literature had withered away. The Catholic Church, zealous in its doctrines, discouraged and often forbade the study of what it called pagan or impious knowledge. To read Virgil or Homer, Livy or Tacitus was seen as dangerous to one's faith. To explore natural science or medicine, to build new industries or cultivate the arts, these were pursuits of little worth to the rigid guardians of doctrine. And so it was that Spain never tasted the glory of Gothic architecture in those days. That marvelous art of poetry in stone, which people today call Gothic, was unknown to them. It would not appear in Spain for another 400 years after the Goths themselves had vanished. Even now, ruins of magnificent Roman constructions dot the land, silent witnesses to an age of knowledge and craft. Yet of the Visigoths, of their palaces, temples, and towers, there remains almost nothing. Their architecture left no enduring mark upon the land they ruled for centuries. When Ataulfo first led the Visigothic people over the Pyrenees, they entered a land where Latin was already the common tongue, spoken in the marketplaces and written in laws. Centuries later, when Roderick fell at Guadalete, Latin was still the language of their kingdom. The Goths had come with their own tongue, but it was swallowed up, absorbed into Roman speech and custom. They became rulers without their own language, and a nation without a national language is a nation destined to die. Their state was silent, voiceless, already dead within, even before the sword struck. Just as the mighty King Wamba was shorn and draped in monk's robes by the power of the church, forced to abandon his throne and fade away, so too was the entire Visigothic kingdom stripped of strength, silent, and doomed to vanish at the first touch of a new conqueror.